Did you ever have one of these signs on your street growing up? I distinctly remember this specific sign was up in my neighborhood, right? It's a sign that says Neighborhood Watch, and it's got a picture of a shadowy figure, and they always have some reference to the fact that the neighbors are watching out for each other, and if you should think about committing a crime, you better think twice, because this neighborhood is protected by a Neighborhood Watch. I don't know if you had that experience growing up. I grew up in Omaha, and so it was a bit of a bigger city, and we had these all over the place. And I remember it made me feel a couple of different things. First of all, it made me a little bit uneasy because it made me feel like bad things were happening in my neighborhood. Like my neighborhood maybe wasn't safe if we had to have a Neighborhood Watch set up. Secondly, it made me feel like people were spying on me, like there was always somebody just around the corner to see if I was behaving, and if I did something wrong or stepped out of line, then they'd call the police, or even worse, they'd call my parents. I don't know about you, but as I reflect on my community growing up, I wasn't that close to the people around me. We didn't feel like a close-knit family. We didn't feel like a group of people who knew each other. It felt more like a bunch of strangers who randomly saw each other outside. I had some friends, I had some places that I'd go to, I had some people that I was close to, but all in all, my neighborhood didn't feel like a community of people that I was friends with. I don't know if that's your story or not, but as we look at this idea of being a good neighbor through the lens of the Good Samaritan and through the lens of being a steward of the relationship that God has given us, we come across this idea that being a good neighbor is kind of like the Neighborhood Watch. A good neighbor takes care of his neighbors, watches out for them, is on patrol, as it were, to see what goes on in the neighborhood and report anything that's suspicious or erroneous. As I began to reflect on this idea about a good neighbor and Neighborhood Watch, I was reminded of Jesus' words in John 10, where he talks about being a good shepherd, where he talks about this idea that he is a good shepherd and that he connects that idea, I think, a little bit with being a good neighbor. Let's read that story in John 10. I tell you the truth. Anyone who sneaks over the wall of a shepherd rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. He has gathered his own flock, and he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They will run from him because they don't know his voice. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. A hired hand will run when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him, and he isn't their shepherd. So the wolf attacks them and scatters the flock. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep, and they know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. So I sacrifice my life for the sheep. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and they know me. He says he calls them by name and they respond to his voice. And Jesus puts himself as the role of the good shepherd who cares for his sheep. Now, I think if maybe we recontextualize this parable or put it into the words that we're using today, Jesus might say, I am the good neighbor. I create a safe space in the people's hearts around me. They know my voice. They know my place as a safe place, and they flock to my voice. Now, I think that if we as Christians embrace this idea that Jesus equips us and calls us to be good neighbors in the same way that he calls and equips himself to be the good shepherd, then we can draw some parallels, draw some conclusions, draw some insights into what it means to be a good neighbor. What does it look like to protect our flock? What does it look like to create a safe space for our flock, our people, our neighbors to rest and to find relaxation? In what ways do we take this attitude of what the church is outside of the church walls and into our communities and neighborhoods? What if we viewed our job as Christians, as Christ followers, not to show up at church, but to bring the church with us into our neighborhoods, to be the primary place where people see and experience God's grace, not by coming to join us on a Sunday morning, but by being with them in the neighborhood where God has placed us? What if part of the reason that you live where you live in the neighborhood and community that you live in is because you're fulfilling a call that God has for you to be a good neighbor? to be a missionary, as it were, to the people on your street, the people up and down and across who live close to you. To be a shepherd, to create a safe space within your neighborhood for people to belong and to hear about Jesus and to know that there's something beyond themselves out there. I think the parallels between being a good shepherd and being a good neighbor are really, really similar. And if we allow ourselves to go down there, we can learn about what it means to be a protector in our neighborhood and to create a community environment where Jesus is lifted high in our actions. What would it look like for you in your neighborhood to live as a missionary, to create safe space and to provide opportunities for people to come to know Jesus? What would that look like? What could that look like? And how might God be asking you to create a similar attitude and idea in your neighborhood and community? I hope you have a great discussion. I'll see you right back here next week.